Let me just give you one more example to close this particular point. Chomsky became very famous. Chomsky, of course, one of the characteristics of Chomskyan linguistics, which is different than Saussurean, is that he emphasizes syntax as opposed to phonology. Signifier is mostly made out of phonological parts of language. Also formal aspects, non-semantic parts of language, but not the syntactical part. The continental school in the hands of Benveniste and several other linguists went on to, of course, develop syntax, but that was not what was developed at the beginning. Chomsky wanted from the beginning to start with syntax, and he invented a famous phrase which became very famous, particularly when he was still a linguist, to show us that, in fact, syntax is independent of semantics. He said, think of the following sentence. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, that's a sentence that doesn't mean anything, because ideas don't sleep, and they are not green because they don't have any colors, and if they were green, then they would not be colorless, and if they slept, they would not sleep furiously. Nevertheless, everyone can recognize that the sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, is a sentence of English. It's a correct sentence of English, meaning it has the right syntactical pattern, the right syntactical structure, even though the semantics is completely wrong. You can immediately tell colorless green ideas sleep furiously from green furiously sleeps ideas colorless. I mean, the same words just randomly arranged don't form a sentence. They form a sentence if they follow each other in the right arrangement. But when Chomsky invented his famous sentence, he did not go out there in the university to ask people, does this seem grammatical to you? Does this seem grammatical to you? In other words, he did not interview people. He did not went out there into the world to see if he could gather evidence. He said to himself, well, I'm a speaker of English. I speak good English. Everybody knows that I do. So I'm going to use myself as my sole informant. And he did that, exactly. And many linguists have used themselves as their own informants instead of, like Labov, going out there with a tape recorder and trying to figure out what's going on out there in the world. So when you use yourself as your own informant, and you are a speaker of a standard English, an artificially frozen version of the language, you are bound to find much more fixity, much more immobility in the language, and you are bound to invent concepts like the synchronic dimension of language, or language, as Chomsky says, being a genetically inherited machine that we have in our brain. That's what language is for Chomsky, a universal grammar that is fixed in the genes and cannot be changed, and it's in our brain. That sense of fixity it was an optical illusion. It was an optical illusion that could have been avoided if they had all been like Labov, if they had all carried a microphone around and actually confronted the heterogeneity of language, going out there and studying an entire population of acoustic matter, and then studying that, sampling it statistically and finding out what patterns formed, whether they correspond to social strata, and so on. So Labov is one of the main sources of inspiration for Deleuze, and you're going to find a discussion of sociolinguistics in that chapter of 1,000 Plateaus that I just mentioned, Principles of Linguistics. Another source of inspiration is a British philosopher called Austin. Austin is very famous as a philosopher of language for having discovered, or for having for the first time discussed, another aspect of language, another social aspect of language, what he called the illocutionary force of language. Language, of course, has a semantic content, and we communicate ideas using that semantic content. But in addition to that, different arrangements of words can produce different social commitments. A certain arrangement of words may be a promise. And in addition to what you promise, I promise to take care of your kids tomorrow. In addition to the semantic content, taking care of your kids tomorrow, there is the social commitment that is created by the very utterance of that sentence. The speech act, as Austin called it. There are a whole variety of different speech acts, questions, requests, but the most important for Deleuze is the speech act of a command, an order. This is, of course, a type of speech act that exists in any organization that has an authority structure, not only the military. The military clearly has an authority structure with a very clear chain of command, and commands and orders are constantly being given, and you assume, if you're a sergeant, a lieutenant, and so on, that if you get an order, it's a legitimate order because it came from all the chain of command all the way down to you, and you can now pass it to the infantry because that is a legitimate command. But commands exist in schools, commands exist in hospitals, commands exist in prisons, commands exist in factories, anywhere, and families when parents order their kids, not to chew gum on the table or anything. And the semantic content of a command is important, but also the illocutionary force, the binding force, the social commitment that comes after you've been given a command. After you've been given a command, you have changed your social position. If you do not comply with the order, you can be considered to have disobeyed the order. And depending on what organization you're in, you can either be fired if you're a nurse in a hospital that refused to comply with a command from a doctor. You can be in prison or sent to solitary confinement if you're in a prison. You can be punished in a whole variety of ways, like by lowering your rank in the military. There are social consequences that directly stem from disobeying a command. So illocutionary force is another one of those things that is not included in your typical Saussurean or Chomskyan theory of language, but it is what interfaces language to the world. And again, if we're going to be working here in the tradition of Labov, in which what we want to is go out there and confront a population of linguistic entities, a population of acoustic materials, we want to know what those acoustic materials can do. And one of the things they can do, in addition to communicating content, semantic contents from one person to another, is creating social commitments. Now, in that chapter, Deleuze says, in fact, it begins that way, with a concept he calls the order word, that is the most basic aspect of language, to instruct. Now, they don't unfortunately elaborate very much on the argument, so I'm going to give my own argument. And let's imagine right now humanity before language emerged. Say humanity as hunter-gatherers about 70,000 years ago. We can time roughly the origin of language because a whole variety of anatomical changes had to occur before language became possible, and even though the oral languages of the hunter-gatherers didn't leave any fossils, and therefore we don't know how to create a history of those oral languages, the vocal apparatus, the anatomical apparatus needed to produce those sounds did leave fossils. In particular, our larynx had to come down from the place where it normally is in chimpanzees so that we could produce the whole range of vowels from A to the U, and the whole range of consonants, which was not possible had the larynx stayed up there. We paid evolutionarily for that because the position the larynx is right now doesn't allow us to breathe and swallow at the same time. Everybody has choked on a piece of meat or a piece of bread when you were like trying to swallow and someone makes you laugh and you get a gulp of air trying to breathe in. And they contradict each other. Nature, evolution, is a tinkerer. It doesn't ever optimize. It just does whatever it can do with whatever, in a very opportunistic way, with whatever elements it has. In our case, it made us weaker because we cannot, it's very easy for us to choke, but nevertheless, it forced that larynx down until it reaches its current position, and we could now produce the entire range of acoustic matter or of linguistic materials that we are used to. And we can look at the fossils and see, when roughly, or between what kind of decades or even centuries, the larynx reached this point. So we know, roughly, that language came about 70,000 years ago, when we still were hunter-gatherers, way before we discovered agriculture. It was about 10,000 years ago.